The cedar oil was the first thing you noticed. Rich, resinous, old, in a way that made the air feel thick with memory. It clung to the walls of the great library at Alexandria the way a language clings to the tongue of a child who learned it before she learned to walk, naturally, effortlessly, as though it had always lived there. She was 9 years old, and she was alone in the room, and she was not lonely. The scrolls surrounded her like silent teachers, patient as stone, and she pressed her small fingers along the edge of one, papyrus, cool and faintly rough, and felt the particular pleasure of something ancient becoming hers. Outside, the harbour caught the winter sun and scattered it in pieces across the water. Inside, there was only the amber glow of lamp oil and the sound of her own breathing and the growing, unnameable sensation that the world was not a single thing, it was many things. It was a different colour depending on which language you held it in. Go ahead and settle in now. Adjust the pillow, pull the blanket just a little closer, because what this girl was quietly becoming in that cedar-smelling room is one of the most extraordinary things this world has ever produced, and you will want to be still for it. Her name was Cleopatra, and she was learning Demotic Egyptian, not Greek, which was the tongue of her royal bloodline, the language of courts and marble and carefully worded ambition, but the language of the farmers and the fishermen and the people who sold figs outside the palace walls. She wanted to speak to them. She wanted them to look into her eyes and hear their own world reflected back, without the softening filter of a translator standing between one human being and another. This desire, to reach across the air between two people and actually arrive, would define everything she ever did. By the time she was a young woman, Cleopatra could speak 9 languages, Demotic Egyptian as she had begun, Koine Greek her royal native tongue, Aramaic, the old and wandering language of traders who carried their homes in their words, Ethiopic, Hebrew, the language of the Parthians, the language of the Medes, the troglodytes who lived in the cliffs along the Red Sea coast and whose tongue sounded, to foreign ears, like music played backward, and still she learned. There was a scribe in the library, a small, gentle man named Jedhor, who had watched her since she was 7 years old. He had seen many children of the royal house move through these rooms with the bored, wandering attention of those who have never had to want anything. But this one was different. This one read until the lamps burned low. This one asked questions that sat in a man's chest, long after she had left the room. He never told anyone what he saw in her in those early years. Some things are too large for ordinary words, and so they are kept quietly, carried forward in the telling. There is a particular kind of smile that has nothing to do with happiness. It lives on the face of someone who has learned, young and without gentleness, that the world will not offer them the luxury of showing what they truly feel. Cleopatra had learned this smile before she had learned to ride a horse, before she had finished growing into her own hands, and by the time she sat across from her younger brother at the long banquet table in the royal palace at Alexandria, the smile was so practiced it had become a kind of armor, seamless, beautiful, and utterly impenetrable. Her brother's name was Ptolemy. He was 10 years old and already being taught by ambitious men to want things that were not his yet. She watched him from across the table with the calm attentiveness of someone who has read every scroll ever written about what happens to royal families when power is left poorly guarded. She was 17. He was a child still soft at the edges, being sharpened by men who needed him pointed in a particular direction. She understood this with a clarity that must have been exhausting, the way one understands a door but is slowly, quietly closing. The Ptolemaic dynasty had been built on brilliance and sustained by betrayal. These were not exceptional circumstances, they were simply the weather of that world, and Cleopatra had grown up walking through it with her face carefully arranged. Siblings had killed siblings in this palace. Mothers had not protected children. Children had not protected mothers. Love and proximity had proven, generation after generation, to be a dangerous combination, like fire and linen left too close together in a warm room. She had a younger sister too, Arsinoe, small and watchful, with eyes that moved across a room the way water moves across stone, quietly, constantly, finding every crack. Cleopatra loved her with the careful, measured love of someone who knows that love alone has never once protected anyone inside these walls. The palace smelled of jasmine and roasting meat and, underneath both, something colder. Something that had no name but that Cleopatra had learned to recognize before she knew what to call it. It was the smell of people wanting things. It was the particular atmosphere of a room where everyone is performing safety and no one is actually safe. She had grown up breathing it the way other children grew up breathing salt air by the sea, so thoroughly that she could no longer imagine air that did not carry it. What she wanted, and what she would never say, not once, not to anyone, was simply to be left alone to read. To walk through the library with Jedhor and argue peacefully about the shifting grammar of Aramaic. To sit by the harbour in the early morning when the fishing boats came in and practice the demotic words for net and tide and enough. To govern wisely, to be trusted to govern wisely, to be given the quiet space that wisdom requires and that power almost never permits. She would not get these things, not cleanly, not without cost. But she sat at the table and she smiled at her brother, and her brother smiled back, and the men standing behind him watched her with the patient, predatory attention of those who have already decided what they will do and are only waiting for the right season. Outside, Alexandria hummed along the harbour with its usual gorgeous indifference, merchants and philosophers and fishermen and lovers, all of them moving through the evening in their own private orbits, none of them knowing that the girl at the banquet table was already deciding, quietly and alone, how she intended to survive what was coming. She reached for her wine, she let the smile hold its shape, and somewhere, far beneath it, in the part of her that only the cedar-smelling library had ever known, something very small and very tired closed its eyes and rested and waited for morning. There is a market in Alexandria that has existed, in one form or another, for as long as the city has had walls to hold it. It runs along the edge of the old harbour district, where the stone streets narrow and the smell of the sea gives way to the smell of cumin and warm bread and the particular sweet rot of overripe figs left too long in the afternoon heat. It is the kind of place where 20 languages live inside 50 feet of air, where a Nubian spice merchant argues price with a Jewish textile trader, while a Greek philosopher walks past, talking to no one, and all of it happens simultaneously, in beautiful, chaotic, entirely human overlap. Cleopatra had been coming here since she was a girl, slipping from the palace with the quiet determination of someone who understands that the world taught in scrolls and the world that actually exists are two entirely different countries. The scrolls were essential, but this, the heat, the noise, the press of real bodies and real want and real language tumbling through the open air, this was where she learned something the scrolls could not teach her. She learned what her people sounded like when no one of consequence was listening. Pull the blanket a little closer now. What comes next is the part of Cleopatra's story that history has most thoroughly and most deliberately misplaced. Not the romance, not the politics, but this, the extraordinary, almost incomprehensible gift of a queen who could walk into any corner of her vast and complicated kingdom and simply talk to the people she found there, in their own words, without a man standing between them translating both the language and, inevitably, the meaning. No pharaoh before her had done this, not one. For 300 years the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt had governed a land whose language they never learned, whose gods they worshipped only in the careful, calculated way of politicians, adopting a useful religion. They had remained Greek in all the ways that mattered, in their speech, in their tastes, in the invisible but absolute wall they kept between themselves and the ancient, breathing civilization they had inherited without ever truly entering. Cleopatra walked through that wall as though it were made of smoke. She spoke demotic to the fig sellers and they looked at her the way people look when they hear something they did not know. They were waiting for, with a sudden involuntary openness, a relaxing of something held long and tight. She spoke Aramaic to the traders from the east with a fluency that made old men pause mid-sentence and reconsider her entirely. Ses. He learned the particular honorifics of the Ethiopian merchants, the ones that signaled respect for age, and she used them correctly. And the men who received them stood a little straighter for the rest of the afternoon without quite knowing why. There was a woman in the market, a bread seller named Tamet, wide and unhurried, who had sold the same honey and sesame loaves from the same spot for 30 years. She had seen royalty pass through the market before, always at a distance, always moving quickly, always surrounded by the particular atmosphere of people who are somewhere else, even when they are standing right in front of you. When the young queen stopped at her stall and spoke to her in demotic, not the careful, formal demotic of official documents, but the warm, colloquial demotic of someone who has been listening to real people speak it for years, Tamit stood very still for a moment. Then she handed Cleopatra a piece of bread, warm from the morning baking, and said something that no translator ever recorded, and Cleopatra laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and brief, and paid twice what was asked. Tamit told her daughters about this for the rest of her life, not that the queen had been beautiful, which she had, not that she had been powerful, which she was, but that she had sounded like someone who meant what she said. In Tamit's language, in the language of the bread and the harbour and the long Egyptian morning. This is what none of the Roman historians bothered to write down, because it did not fit the story they were already telling. They wanted a seductress. They wanted a schemer draped in gold. They were not interested in a scholar who had spent 20 years learning how to make strangers feel, for a moment, genuinely known. That is a quieter power than the ones men tend to record. But it is, in many ways, the rarer one. The desert knew her name. The rarer one. The desert knew her name. The rare Iver people knew her name. The priests of a dozen different gods spoke of her in the same breath as the gods themselves, and this was not coincidence or propaganda. It was the return long overdue and deeply felt of someone who had taken the trouble to arrive. The night she came to Caesar, the Mediterranean was restless. It moved against the harbour walls of Alexandria with the low, irregular rhythm of something that cannot quite settle, neither storm nor calm, but the uneasy in-between that sailors distrust and poets have always loved. The torches along the royal dock cast their reflections in long, broken columns across the water, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the breakwater, a small boat moved without lights, low and quick, carrying something the most powerful man in the world was not expecting. She was 21 years old, and she had been driven from her own palace by her own brother's advisors, men who had decided that a queen who spoke 9 languages and walked through markets and inspired genuine devotion in the people she governed was, for their particular purposes, far too difficult to control. She had fled into the desert. She had spent months in exile building an army with the focused, unsentimental efficiency of someone who has never once confused feeling frightened with being defeated. And now she had come back, not with her army, not yet with herself. The story that would be told for 2,000 years, the one about the carpet, about being unrolled at Caesar's feet like a gift, about the great Roman general charmed by the beautiful Egyptian queen, is not wrong exactly. It is simply incomplete in the way that a painting of the sea is incomplete. It captures the colour but not the cold, the surface but not the depth, the image but not the ting itself. She did not come to Caesar as a supplicant. She came as a strategist who had assessed with extraordinary precision exactly what Julius Caesar needed and exactly what she had to offer him. He was in Alexandria because Pompey had been murdered there, his great rival, his former ally, killed on an Egyptian beach by men who thought it would please him, and it had not pleased him at all. Caesar was in a foreign city, surrounded by a population that did not want him, holding a political situation that was unraveling in several directions at once. He needed Egypt stable. He needed Egypt's grain. He needed someone who could give him both, and who had sufficient authority to make that gift mean something. She needed an army she didn't have. She needed the weight of Rome behind her name. She needed to walk back into her own palace and take back what was hers, and she needed to do it without a war that would cost the country she loved more than it could afford to lose. Rest here for a moment. Let your eyes grow a little heavier. Let the harbour sounds settle around you. Because what happened when these two people sat across from each other in the lamplight of an Egyptian night is more interesting than the version that has been handed down. Two of the most intelligent people of their century, from entirely different worlds, discovering in each other someone they had not quite encountered before, someone whose mind moved at the same speed as their own. Caesar was 52. He had conquered Gaul. He had crossed the Rubicon. He had seen most of the known world and met most of its rulers, and had formed, through long experience, a fairly reliable expectation of what kings and queens were like. They were, in his experience, either frightened or arrogant, and sometimes, in the way of cornered animals, both simultaneously. They wanted things from him, and they tried to conceal this, and the concealment was usually transparent, and the meetings were long, and the wine was accept. Table and very little of lasting interest was ever said. Cleopatra spoke to him in Latin, not halting diplomatic Latin, fluent, precise, occasionally witty Latin, the Latin of someone who has read the literature and understood the jokes. Caesar, by several accounts, laughed. It is a small detail and an enormous one, the laugh of a man who expected one thing and received something genuinely different. They talked through the night, not only of armies and grain and political arrangements, though all of these things were discussed with the careful thoroughness they deserved. They talked about language, about the way different tongues divide the world at different seams, so that some things can be said in Egyptian that have no equivalent in Latin, and some Roman concepts dissolve entirely when you try to hold them in Greek. They talked about Alexander, whose city this was, whose dream had made this strange multicultural harbour civilization possible. They talked about what Egypt was, not as a territory to be managed, but as a thing in itself, ancient and continuous, and indifferent to the ambitions of any particular century. She made him see it. That was the gift. She made the most powerful man in the world look at the country she loved through her eyes, and for a few hours in a lamplit room above the restless harbour, he saw it. They would become allies. They would become lovers. They would have a son, whom she named Caesarion, little Caesar, and she would raise him alone, as she did most things, with competence and without complaint. And without complaint, and without complaint, Caesar would return to Rome and be killed on the steps of the Senate, and the world would shift on its axis in a way that neither of them could have predicted on that quiet, consequential night. But for now there was only the lamplight, and two remarkable minds finding each other across the distance of everything that separated them, and tea. He harbour outside, still restless and unresolved, moving against the old stones with a sound like something trying very gently to stay awake. There is a particular quality to the light in Aglanzeria in the early morning before the city has fully decided to begin. It comes in low and golden across the harbour, touching the water first, then the white stone of the buildings along the shore, then finally, reluctantly, the interior rooms where people are still sleeping or pretending to sleep or lying awake with the specific populated silence of those who have too many thoughts and not enough dark left to hold them in. It is the light of the in-between, not night, not day, but the brief and tender country that exists in the passage between the two. Cleopatra had always loved this hour. It was the one time the palace felt something close to honest. She would sit in the room that faced the harbour and nurse her son in the early light, and for a little while the world contracted to something almost manageable. The weight of him in her arms, the small, urgent sounds he made, the way his hand would curl around her finger with the absolute, uncomplicated trust of someone who does not yet know that trust is a thing that can be misplaced. He smelled of milk and warmth and something indefinably new, the way all babies smell, as though they have brought with them some trace of wherever it is that people come from before they arrive here. She called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. It was a political name and a mother's name simultaneously, as most things in her life were required to be both at once. He had his father's brow and her eyes, dark and watchful, and already somehow paying attention. She would look at him in the early light and feel the thing that parents have always felt, and that no language she spoke had ever found adequate words for. That absolute, annihilating love Hat arrives without warning and rearranges everything. That makes the world simultaneously more beautiful and more terrifying than it has ever been before, because now there is something in it that you cannot afford to lose. Caesar was dead. The Senate steps. The Ides of March. The news had come to Alexandria the way catastrophic news always comes, too quickly and not quickly enough, in fragments that had to be assembled into a shape too large and too wrong to look at directly. She had sat very still when she heard it, in the way of someone absorbing something that cannot be absorbed all at once, that must be taken in slowly over days, like water into stone. She had not wept where anyone could see her. This was not coldness. This was the discipline of a woman who understood that the moment she showed the world a wound, the world would reach for it. Breathe slowly now. Let the room around you grow quieter. What she was navigating in the years after Caesar's death was something that would have unmade most people, not through any single catastrophic blow, but through the relentless, grinding accumulation of impossible demands. She was a mother. She was a queen. She was the ruler of the wealthiest nation in the known world. She was a woman in a world governed almost entirely by men who found powerful women convenient to use and dangerous to respect. She was alone in the specific way that people at the very top of every hierarchy are always alone, surrounded by people and unable ever to simply put the weight down. She governed, she administered, she managed Egypt's grain supply with the kind of meticulous, data-driven attention that modern economists would recognize and admire. She oversaw the irrigation systems that made the Nile Valley bloom. She adjudicated disputes in multiple languages, in person, sitting in the great hall where pharaohs had sat for 3,000 years before her, understanding as they had understood that the physical presence of power matters, that people need to see their ruler as something real and human and attentive, not as a distant arrangement of decrees. She did all of this, and then she went back to the room that faced the harbour, and she sat with her son in the early light. Caesarion grew. He was bright and curious, with a particular talent for mathematics that delighted her and reminded her, in complicated ways, of the man who had given him his name. She taught him languages herself, beginning as she had begun, with the language of the people. She walked with him through the markets, this small boy with his watchful eyes, and she let him hear the city in all its beautiful plurality. She was teaching him, as Jedhor had once quietly taught her, that the world is made of people, and that people deserve to be met where they actually are. There was a nurse, a woman named Iras, gentle and unshakable, who had been with Cleopatra since before Caesarion was born. Iras would take the boy when the weight of governance made the morning unbearable, and she would walk him through the palace gardens and name things for him in 4 languages simultaneously, so that he grew up understanding, in the wordless way of very young children, that any single thing could be many things depending on who was holding it. Cleopatra watched this from the doorway sometimes, her son's small hand in Iras's larger one, the garden green and unhurried in the morning, the harbour just visible beyond the walls, blue and ancient, and entirely indifferent to the ambitions of any particular century. She had named him after the sun, and the sun was not enough, and she knew this, and she loved him anyway with everything she had, which was considerable, and which would, in the end, not be enough either. But the morning light came in, ow and golden as it always did, touching the water first. And for a little while it was only this, the boy, the garden, the harbour, the light, and it was, in its quiet and temporary way, everything. The grain moved first, before the soldiers, before the ships, before any of the grand and documented machinery of alliance and war. The grain moved, in long, slow convoys down the Nile and into the harbour at Alexandria and out across the Mediterranean to wherever it was needed most. Hundreds of thousands of tons of it. Egyptian wheat, Egyptian barley, Egyptian abundance managed and directed by Egyptian administrative systems that Cleopatra had spent years refining with the patient, unglamorous attention of someone who understands that empires are not built on battles alone. They are built on the quiet, essential, entirely unsexy infrastructure of people being fed. She understood this the way she understood language, not as an abstraction but as a living thing with texture and weight and consequence. A hungry army does not fight. A hungry city does not hold. A hungry city does not hold. A hungry population does not remain loyal to a ruler who has allowed them to become hungry, no matter how beautiful that ruler is, no matter how many languages she speaks, no matter how many scrolls she has read in a cedar-smelling library by lamplight. The grain was not logistics. The grain was power, expressed in the most fundamental terms available, the terms of survival, of the body, of the irreducible human need to eat and be warm and continue. She controlled the grain, she always had, and when Mark Antony came into her world, this large, warm, charismatic Roman, with his soldier's laugh and his genuine talent for being liked, she brought to their alliance not a beautiful face, arranged strategically across a golden barge, though the barge was real and the effect was deliberate, and she was not above understanding, engaging the uses of spectacle. She brought the entirety of Egypt's productive capacity. She brought the ships, she brought the routes, she brought 20 years of administrative knowledge so thorough and so precise that it would not be matched in that part of the world for centuries. Settle deeper now, let the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, because this chapter of her life is the one that requires the most careful looking, not because it is complicated, not because it is complicated, but because it has been so thoroughly painted over that finding the real thing underneath requires patience and a willingness to see past the gold. The meeting on the river Cydnus has been described so many times, in so many languages, by so many writers who were not there, that it has calcified into something more myth than memory. The silver oars, the purple sails, the perfumed air drifting to shore ahead of the barge like an announcement. Cleopatra dressed as Aphrodite, which was not costume but theology, a deliberate invocation of divine authority in the visual language that the people of that world understood and took seriously. Mark Antony sitting on his throne on the shore, waiting, while the entire population of Tarsus abandoned him to go and see what was arriving on the water. This is described always as seduction. It was strategy wearing seduction's clothes, which is a different thing entirely, and she knew the difference precisely, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about her. She assessed Antony the way she assessed every powerful person she encountered, with the clear, unsentimental intelligence of someone who has never been able to afford illusions. He was capable and warm and genuinely impressive in the ways that soldiers are impressive, physically brave, instinctively loyal, better at inspiring men than managing them. He needed what she had: organizational clarity, financial depth, the Eastern Mediterranean's goodwill, which she carried in her name like a currency. She needed what he had. Roman military authority. She needed what he had. Roman military authority, the legal weight of Rome behind decisions that would otherwise be disputed. The particular protection that came from being allied with someone the rest of the world was not quite ready to fight. They were, in the coldest possible accounting, useful to each other. And then something less cold happened, which neither of them had necessarily planned for, which is one of the things that makes them human and their story worth the telling. They genuinely liked each other, not in the careful, diplomatic way of people who have decided to perform warmth for political purposes, but in the specific, irreducible way of two people who find each other interesting. Antony made her laugh, a real laugh, the unguarded kind, the kind that Tamet the bread seller had once heard in the market and never forgotten. She made him think, which was not something he was entirely accustomed to, and which he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he enjoyed. She gave him 3 children. She gave him Egypt's wealth, directed with extraordinary precision toward their shared campaigns. She planned supply lines. She managed the finances of a military operation that spanned the Eastern Mediterranean with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. When the campaign in Parthia failed, and it failed, as campaigns do, through a combination of bad luck and worse timing, It was her ships that came, her grain, her medical supplies, her organizational capacity, deployed without ceremony or complaint, because there was no time for ceremony, and complaint had never once in her life solved anything. None of the paintings show this. None of the Roman histories linger here. The image that survived, the one that 2,000 years of storytelling has preferred and polished and handed forward, is the barge, the perfume, the purple sails, the seductress on the water, passive and glittering, waiting to be claimed. The warehouses are empty in the paintings. The grain convoys move through no one's imagination. The administrative records that kept an entire military alliance alive are dust now, or ash, or simply lost in the way that practical things are always lost while decorative things are always lost, while decorative things are preserved, because the world has always been better at keeping beauty than keeping truth. But the grain moved. It always moved. Long before the paintings, long after them, through every gilded myth and every Roman slander, the grain moved, and the ships moved with it, and the woman who directed both of them looked out across her harbour with the calm, clear eyes of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and has never once needed anyone to notice. The figs were perfect that morning. This is the kind of detail that history has no use for, and that matters more than almost anything else, the particular, perishable, unrepeatable fact of a bowl of figs on a low table in a sunlit room, each one dark and yielding and exactly ripe, the kind of ripe that lasts only a single day before tipping over into something else. Someone had chosen them carefully, had walked through the market in the early hours before the heat settled in, and pressed each one gently with a thumb, and selected only the ones that gave in the precise right way. Someone had arranged them in a bowl of pale blue Egyptian faience, the kind that catches the morning light and holds it. Someone had carried them to the room where the queen would have her breakfast, and set them down, and gone back to whatever came next in their ordinary day. Cleopatra ate one slowly. She looked at the harbour. The city was doing what Alexandria always did in the early morning, assembling its elf, piece by piece, out of the raw materials of human routine. The fishermen were coming in. The fishermen were coming in. She could see the sails, small and white at this distance, moving against the flat blue of the sea with the unhurried confidence of things that have done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. The market was beginning its low, layered hum. Somewhere below the palace walls a bread seller was calling out in demotic, the same phrase repeated with the patient rhythm of someone who knows the words will eventually find the ears they are looking for. A cart moved slowly along the harbour road. A child ran after a dog that was not going to stop. She had been awake since before the light came. This was not unusual. She had always lived at the edge of sleep, in the thin hours when the mind moves differently, more honestly, less defended, following thoughts to places it avoids in the full brightness of the day. She had lain in the dark that morning and listened to Alexandria breathing, and she had thought about her children, Caesarion, 17, now, and serious in the way she had been serious, watching everything, saying less than he knew. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, 10 years old and still young enough to run through the palace gardens without self-consciousness, still young enough to find lizards interesting, still young enough to believe that the world was primarily a place where interesting things happened to you rather than a place you had to navigate with great care and very little margin for error. And Ptolemy Philadelphus, the youngest, 6 years old and soft-cheeked and inclined toward long afternoon naps in warm patches of sunlight, like a small and dignified cat. Let yourself grow still now. Let the harbour sounds reach you from a very great distance, the way sounds reach you when you are almost asleep. Present but softened, real but no longer urgent, because this morning, this specific morning, with the perfect figs and the fishing boats and the bread seller's patient call, is the kind of morning that exists just before everything changes, and neither she nor the bread seller nor the fisherman nor the child chasing the dog knows this yet. And there is something in that unknowing that is almost unbearable to witness, even across 2,000 years. There was a woman who did her hair, a woman named Charmian, who had been with Cleopatra for so long that the daily ritual of her preparation had become something closer to conversation than service. Charmian moved through the morning with quiet efficiency, her hands certain and unhurried, and they talked while she worked, not about Rome, not about Octavian and his advancing legions, not about the military situation that was tightening around Alexandria the way a hand tightens around something it intends to keep. They talked about small things, about Ptolemy Philadelphus's new habit of naming every pigeon in the palace garden, about the bread seller below whose voice Cleopatra had been listening to for 20 years and whose name she had known for 19 of them, about a particular manuscript that had arrived in the library the previous week, a Parthian text on astronomical observation that the librarian had been almost unable to contain his excitement about. Charmian laughed at this, at the image of old Apollodorus practically vibrating with scholarly joy over a new scroll, and Cleopatra laughed too, and the laughter moved through the morning room and out toward the harbour, and dissolved there, the way laughter does, into the general beautiful noise of a city that does not know it is having its last ordinary day. The figs sat in their pale blue bowl, one remaining, dark and perfect, and exactly ripe. Outside, the fishing boats were in. The market was fully awake now, a living organism of commerce and language and human need spreading along the harbour road the way it had spread every morning for 300 years. The bread seller had found his customers. The child and the dog had resolved whatever their disagreement had been, or perhaps simply moved it elsewhere out of sight. The city hummed and breathed and continued, as cities do, with the magnificent, indifferent continuity of something that has outlasted many things and expects to outlast many more. Cleopatra looked at the harbour for a long time, the light on the water, the white sails of the fishing boats, still now the day's work already folding into the next one. The limestone buildings along the shore holding their colour against the climbing sun, pale gold, pale white, the colours of things that have stood long enough to stop apologising for being beautiful. She reached for the last fig. She held it for a moment without eating it, feeling its weight, feeling the precise softness of the skin against her palm. Then she set it down again and turned back to the room where Charmian was waiting, and the morning continued, as mornings do, not knowing what it was. Octavian entered Alexandria without a battle. This is the detail that gets lost in the larger noise of what followed. That the city did not fall so much as it was quietly vacated, like a room that empties not because anyone has asked the guests to leave, but because the air has changed in some indefinable way, and staying has become, for reasons no one can quite articulate, no longer possible. Antony's forces dissolved, his generals made their accommodations, his admirals sailed their ships, her ships, the ships she had provisioned and directed, and kept battle ready through years of logistical effort that no one had ever bothered to record, sailed them across to Octavian's side with the smooth, unhurried efficiency of men who have decided which way history is moving and intend to move with it. Antony was already gone by then, in every way that mattered. He had died believing she had betrayed him, which she had not, and this misunderstanding, born of bad information, and the particular fragility of a proud man in an impossible situation, had cost him everything, and her the one person who had cost him everything, in the specific complicated way of genuinely flawed love, chosen her side without being required to. She had watched from the palace windows, the harbour below, her harbour, filling with the wrong ships. Octavian was 22 years younger than Caesar had been when she first met him, and he was nothing like Caesar in almost any way that mattered. Caesar had been a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, someone who could sit in a lamplit room and follow a thought wherever it led, with the unself-conscious pleasure of a person who actually enjoys thinking. Octavian was something more careful than that, more deliberate, more controlled, with the cool, assessing eyes of someone who has decided what the world should look like and is working with considerable patience and considerable ruthlessness toward that precise image. He wanted Egypt. He wanted its grain, its wealth, its ancient and unimaginable abundance. He did not want Cleopatra to complicate his narrative of it. Sit quietly with this for a moment. Let the harbour grow dark in your imagination. Let the wrong ships settle at the wrong docks, because what is about to happen is not the end of a woman's life, so much as the beginning of a woman's erasure, and erasure is slower than death, and quieter, and in many ways more complete. A death can be mourned. An erasure simply accumulates, year by year, version by version, until the thing that is being described no longer resembles the thing that actually existed, and eventually no one is left who remembers the difference Octavian came to see her. He was polite. He was, by all accounts, genuinely careful in the way of someone who is afraid of something, and what he was afraid of, though he would never have said so, was her. Not her armies, which were gone, not her wealth, which he was already in the process of cataloguing and claiming, but her, the particular force of her, the intelligence and the composure and the absolute refusal, even now, to be diminished by the circumstances she found herself in. She received him as a queen. She spoke to him in Latin so precise it required no translation. She presented her financial accounts, her own, her children's, with the methodical clarity of someone who has kept impeccable records and knows it. He listened. He was respectful. He intended to take her to Rome in chains, to walk her through the streets in his triumph, to display her to the Roman crowd as the proof and the prize of his great victory. He did not say this. He did not need to. She had read enough history to know exactly what happened to defeated monarchs in Roman triumphs, how they walked through the city in the conqueror's procession, and then, when the crowd's appetite for spectacle had been satisfied, were quietly disposed of in the Tullianum prison, in the dark, alone. She had no intention of walking through Rome in chains, but the erasure had already begun, not in her lifetime, but in the machinery of it, in the version of her that Octavian's Rome was already constructing in the documents and the speeches and the carefully managed public narrative that would outlast everyone in that room. She was becoming, even as she sat composed and precise and entirely herself, the thing that history preferred, the Eastern temptress, the dangerous foreign queen who had bewitched two great Romans and nearly brought the Republic to its knee, through the unfair, unsporting weaponry of beauty and desire. Not the administrator, not the linguist, not the naval strategist or the monetary reformer, or the scholar who had corresponded with the greatest minds of her age on questions of astronomy and medicine and philosophy, not the mother who had taught her son languages in the marketplace, or the queen who had learnt the names of bread sellers, or the woman who had laughed in a lamplit room with Caesar about the different ways that different languages divide the world at different seams. The scrolls that contained her financial records, meticulous, extraordinary, irreplaceable, were gone within a generation. The administrative systems she had built were absorbed without attribution into the Roman provincial machinery. The languages she had spoken were noted briefly by one historian and then not mentioned again for centuries. The Library of Alexandria, where a small girl had first pressed her fingers to a papyrus scroll, and felt the world open outward in every direction at once. The library was burning, or would burn, or had burned in ways that historians still argue about, which is perhaps itself the most honest metaphor available for what happens to things that cannot defend themselves. The story that survived was simpler and more useful. It had a beautiful woman and two powerful men, and the eternal, comforting suggestion that female power is always, at its root, a kind of performance, a trick of appearance, a manipulation of desire, something that works on the weakness of men rather than through the strength of itself. Rome wrote it down, and Rome, as it turned out, was very good at making things last. The harbour sat quiet under the wrong flag, somewhere in the palace, in a room that faced the sea. A bowl of pale blue faience sat empty on a low table, and the morning light moved across it, the way light moves across things that no longer have anyone to notice them, gently and without meaning, the way time moves through every room that history has finished with, and quietly, without ceremony, left behind. She sent the children away first. This is the thing that the romantic versions of her ending always forget to mention, because it does not fit the image of the tragic queen consumed by her own legend. It is too practical, too maternal, too quietly devastating in the specific way of real things, rather than theatrical ones. Before anything else, before the final preparations, before the door was closed and locked from the inside, she made arrangements for her children with the same methodical care she had brought to every administrative task of her reign. Caesarion, 17 and serious, was sent east along the trade routes toward India with a retinue and funds and letters of introduction written in 3 languages. The younger children were placed in the care of people she trusted, which was a short list and carefully considered. She did what mothers have always done when the world has run out of better options. She put herself between her children and what was coming, and she made sure they could not see her do it. Then she went to the mausoleum she had built for herself on the palace grounds. It was not a desperate place. This is important, and it is something that 2,000 years of tragic retelling have almost entirely obscured, that she chose this room, had designed it herself, had furnished it with intention. There were her most valued manuscripts. There were objects of personal meaning, the kind that accumulate over a life and that only the person who gathered them fully understands. A piece of faience, the precise colour of harbour water on a winter morning, a Parthian astronomical text that had made old Apollodorus tremble with excitement, things that mattered because of what they contained rather than what they were worth, which is a distinction she had always understood and that Octavian, cataloguing her treasury with his cool, appraising eyes, had not. There were lamps, there was wine, there was Charmian, who had done her hair every morning for 20 years, and who was here now, at the end, because some loyalties do not require explanation and cannot be argued out of. Let the room grow very quiet now. Let whatever remains of the day fall away from you, because this is the stillest chapter, the one that moves most slowly, the one that deserves the most careful and unhurried attention. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 22 years. She had spoken 9 languages and administered the most complex economy in the ancient world, and raised 4 children, and negotiated with the most powerful men of her century as an equal, which they had not expected, and which she had never apologized for. She had loved in the specific difficult way that brilliant and guarded people love, not easily, not without cost, but genuinely, which is rarer than it sounds. Octavian had sent word. The triumph was being arranged. She would be expected to appear in Rome at a date already decided, to walk through the streets in the procession he had planned, wearing her own jewelry so that the Roman crowd could see what conquered luxury looked like. He had phrased it with the careful courtesy of a man who has already won and can afford to be polite about it. She had read the letter in the same way she read everything, completely, without flinching, understanding not just what was written, but what was underneath it, the architecture of assumption that held the words in place. She wrote her response with the same precision she had brought to every document of her reign, her financial accounts, updated and complete, instructions F, or the administration of the palace. A letter for Caesarion, sealed, to be opened when he was older, which no one has ever read, and which almost certainly no longer exists, which is perhaps the most private thing in this entire story, and the one that deserves the most silence. She sealed these things with her ring, the ring with the carnelian intaglio that her own image had been carved into, and she set them aside in the order that made sense, because she had always worked in order, because chaos had always been the weapon of people who were not prepared. Charmian moved quietly through the room, tending the lamps. Neither of them spoke much. There are conversations that happen entirely in the space between words, in the quality of a silence, shared between 2 people who have been with each other long enough that language has become, for certain things, insufficient. This was one of those conversations. It lasted the rest of the afternoon, and said everything that needed to be said. The asp, if it was an asp, and the historians debate this, as historians debate everything that threatens to be too symbolic, too perfectly composed, would have been small and dark and quick. The ancient Egyptians called it the royal cobra, the uraeus, the symbol worn on the crown of every pharaoh for 3,000 years, the serpent of divine authority coiled at the brow of every ruler from the time before memory. If she chose it deliberately, and the choosing feels like her, deliberate, precise, saturated with historical meaning, then she was not simply ending her life. She was making an argument. She was saying, in the visual language of a civilization 30 centuries deep, that she was not a prisoner to be displayed and disposed of, but a pharaoh, the last pharaoh, completing her own story in the grammar of her own tradition. Octavian's men broke through the door and found Charmian, still upright, adjusting the crown on her queen's head with hands that were already failing. One of them a young soldier whose name no one recorded, which feels correct, asked Charmian if this was well done, and Charmian said with the last of what she had, that it was well done and befitting, and the descendant of so many kings. Then she too was still. The room held its lamps. The manuscripts sat in their careful order. The harbour moved outside, indifferent and eternal, against the stones it had been moving against, since before the city existed, and would continue moving against long after every person in this story had dissolved into the general human past. Octavian received the news with an expression that those present described as difficult to read, which is perhaps the most honest portrait of him available, the man who wanted everything, and found at the end that what he had was a room and a locked door and a story that had already decided, without his permission, how it intended to be remembered. She had closed that door herself, and it remained in every way that mattered hers. Somewhere beneath the Mediterranean, Alexandria is still there. Not the idea of it, the actual city, or the bones of it, the limestone foundations, and the harbour walls, and the broad canopic streets that ran from the Moon Gate to the Sun Gate through the middle of everything. The earthquakes came, and the sea levels rose across the long, slow centuries, and what had been the greatest city in the ancient world slipped gradually, without drama, beneath the surface of the water that had always surrounded it, the way most important things disappear, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the accumulated patience of time, which is the most thorough of all forces and the least dramatic, and the one that nothing has ever successfully argued with. It is still down there. Divers have found it. Archaeologists with lights and careful hands moving through the green dark water above the old royal quarter, lifting objects from the silt with the reverent slowness of people who understand that what they are touching has not been touched since the world was different. They have found statues, sphinxes, the granite foundations of what may have been the palace itself, resting on the harbour floor in the particular stillness of things that have had a very long time to settle. They have found a face carved in stone that some believe is hers, though the sea has softened it, worn it to something more general. A face that could be anyone's now, which is perhaps appropriate, and perhaps not. Depending on what you believe about what faces are for. Let your eyes rest now. Let the chapters settle around you like water finding its level. The story is almost done, which means it is almost time to carry it with you into sleep. There comes where the best stories go to do their deepest work, not the plot of it, not the dates and the names and the careful sequence of events, but the feeling of it, the texture. The warmth of a cedar-smelling library and a bowl of perfect figs, and a woman laughing in a lamplit room at something genuinely surprising. She has been dead for 2,050 years. She has been dead for 2,050 years, which is a number so large it becomes meaningless if you look at it directly, and meaningful only if you approach it from the side, if you think, instead, of all the individual mornings contained within it. All the harbour lights coming up, all the bread sellers beginning their patient calls, all the children chasing dogs through market streets, and all the mothers watching from doorways, and all the scholars pressing their fingers to the cool edges of scrolls in rooms that smelled of lamp oil and cedar, and the accumulated patience of careful thought. She lived inside that number. She was, mourning out of all of them one specific, unrepeatable, extraordinarily populated morning that burned bright and was gone. But here is what the sand still knows, and what the water holds in its long green memory, and what we know now, sitting together in the dark at the end of this story. She was not what Rome said she was. She was not the beautiful distraction, not the Eastern enchantress, not the cautionary tale about the dangers of female ambition, dressed in the language of tragic romance. She was a woman who learned 9 languages because she believed that every person deserved to be spoken to in their own tongue. She was an administrator of genius who fed her people and managed their resources with a precision that the civilization which replaced her spent a century trying to replicate. She was a mother who sent her son east with letters in 3 languages and a sealed note he was never old enough to open. She was a scholar who corresponded with astronomers and physicians and philosophers, and who understood, in the specific way of people who have thought very carefully about a great many things, that the world is larger and stranger and more various than any single story about it can contain. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt. After her, the line that had begun 3,000 years before, the long, unbroken continuity of a civilization so ancient that Greece was young when it was old, ended, not with a battle, not with a plague, not with the slow erosion of institutions or the quiet failure of ideas. It ended in a locked room above the harbour, at the hand of the person who had, in the end, the most authority over how it ended. There is a kind of power in that which has no name in any of the 9 languages she spoke, or in the ones she did not speak, or in any language that has existed since. It is not victory, it is not defiance, exactly though it contains defiance. It is something closer to authorship, the insistence, made at the greatest possible cost, on being the one who decides how your own story closes. She had spent her entire life in a world that wanted to write her, advisors and brothers and Roman generals, and the whole enormous apparatus of an empire that had decided what she was before she walked into any room. She had spent her entire life reading the room and adapting and surviving and governing and loving and continuing, and at the end of all of it, she picked up the pen herself. Caesarion did not survive. The histories are brief and quiet about this. Octavian had him found and killed before the year was out because a son of Caesar's was too dangerous a loose thread in the story he was weaving, and Octavian was, above all things, a careful editor. The younger children were taken to Rome, which is its own kind of ending and its own kind of beginning. And its own kind of beginning, and Cleopatra Selene, the moon, her daughter, her small girl who had run through the palace gardens without self-consciousness and found lizards interesting, grew up to become a queen herself in the old Roman-client kingdom of Mauritania, ruling wisely and naming her son Ptolemy, which was an act of memory so deliberate it could only have been taught. The library is gone, the palace is under the sea, the manuscripts, the administrative records, the correspondence with astronomers, the financial accounts maintained with such meticulous precision, all of it is ash or silt or simply absent, the way practical things are always absent, while the decorative things are always absent, while the decorative things survive. What survived was the myth, which is always what survives, because myths are lighter than truth and float better in the long crossing of time. But you know the other version now. You have sat with it in the dark across 2,000 years and let it reach you. The girl in the library, the bread seller's patient call, the laughter in the lamplit room, the grain moving before the soldiers, the perfect figs on a morning that did not know it was the last one, the locked door, the adjusted crown. The harbour below the sea moves in the dark, as it has always moved, as it will always move, slowly in the green silence. Slowly in the green silence, above the sunken streets and the softened faces and the granite foundations of everything that was and is no longer and, somehow, in the telling, still remains. She was here. She was extraordinary. And now, in the gentlest possible way, it is time to sleep.